Hi everyone, my name's James Ross. I'm the CTO of Envato. We're just around the corner on King Street. And like Zendesk, we're a lovely, hip, modern company with lots of nice people that's much nicer than working at a bank, and we're always hiring. So come and see us. This is a product you can use to make a website in your browser with no skills at all. But that's not what you need, because you all have technical skills. Who is a developer type person in the room? Who's like, okay, what's everyone else? Apart from someone who doesn't put their hand up. Huh? What? Muggles! Very good, we have some muggles. I'm a muggle. I have, my magic wand doesn't work, I can assure you. But you've been brought here under false pretenses. This is, from what I can tell, the best organised meetup in Melbourne. Round of applause for Jeffrey. I feel like a bit of a cyborg here with 2 microphones and lights and stuff. This is like, I have to do a good job now. But this is a rather complex title to my talk, how to make your team's domain language truly ubiquitous with concept maps. But an alternative title would be, wetware art thou? Hands up if you know the term wetware. Okay, not many people. Can all the people, now leave your hands up, and all the people who don't have their hand up, look at someone who has their hand up and watch what happens next. Can the people with their hand up please point to the wetware? This is the wetware. Okay, so for people who don't know the term, wetware, right? Hands up if you've ever started a new job, come upon a new code base, and recoiled in horror. I want to know where the rest of you work. People who don't have a hand up, where do you work? I'm coming there, okay? This is something we all talk about in software and how bad the code bases we work on are. But where did they come from? Where did they come from? So this talk is about getting you to think about maybe if your software's a mess, maybe it's because the wetware's a mess. So let's proceed. I usually have 3, or I propose that you might have 3 tests for this talk. They're the same 3 I have for any talk. One is that you know more about the subject an hour from now than you do now. That should be fairly easy. The second is that you find something that might actually be useful in your real life tomorrow or sometime soon. And the other is that you have a good time. So they're the tests we'll check at the end. We'll run our tests and see how we go. So the talk is in 3 basic parts. The first is, what the hell are concept maps? Not why should you care yet, but just what are they? The second part is how you can use concept maps in a software domain to transfer knowledge between people. They're really, really good at that. And the third is how you can use them to check whether your teams have a shared mental model. And spoiler alert, they don't. And I'll show you how to check. So, Concept Maps 101. Here we go. A simple example. I need a remote control for this. Let's connect Kent Beck. Who's heard of Kent Beck? I'm an old extreme programmer. What are these? Oh my goodness, these young people have never heard of Kent Beck. Okay, you're supposed to have heard of Kent Beck, but it doesn't really matter. Let's connect Kent Beck and Jeffrey Theobald, who I like to think of as slightly shorter Tim Minchin, on your first concept map, like so. Here is your first concept map. Kent Beck created extreme programming. The things in the boxes are called concepts. And a concept map allows you to say a sentence in some domain. So it's a valid sentence to say that Kent Beck created extreme programming. Is that okay? Am I going too fast? Is that all right? I should also tell you, if you haven't seen me speak before or don't know me, that I'm actually legally blind. I'm not joking, it's kind of weird, but one of the issues is you can see my slides better than I can. But the other one is that if you don't let me know with sound that you're out there. I don't know that you're out there. That's not quite true. So, and if you want to get my attention, do the vigorous hand wavy thing, not the timid hand wavy thing. So, is everyone good with that? That's your first concept map. That wasn't hard, was it? Then we can say extreme programming is an agile methodology. Is that okay? Give me some yes. Okay. So all you do is follow the arrows to make valid sentences. Okay, let's keep going. I know you can keep up. Right. I am making an assertion here that agile methodologies dominate modern software culture. I don't want to argue about that, but I'm old enough to know when it was risky to suggest you do anything agile back in the day, so I'm quite happy with that now. Okay, so that's okay, that's pretty cool. Okay, now, what do we got here? Software art, though, is a concept, and it is a meetup. And the concept of a meetup is something we'd all understand, I assume, otherwise how did you get here? Then we have other concepts like Jeffrey Theobald. He's a concept. You know, we could play word association games about Jeffrey. And Jeffrey works at Zendesk. So this is a concept map where not everything's connected yet, but we can connect those. And we can say, Jeffrey Theobald organises software out there. And he works at Zendesk, and software out there's a meetup. You get it? Now, I'll bring all of those together because, oh no, not yet. I posit that software art thou explores modern software culture. Is that fair, Jeffrey?
Yes.
Yes? Very good. See, blind guy didn't know where he was. He's over there. That's fair, isn't it? I think that's what you try to do. So if I pull all those together, then we get this. Now don't freak out. That's just a graph viz layout of everything I've said before, right? So for my next trick, I will attempt to read this concept map and connect Jeffrey Theobald with Kent Beck in a single breath. Do I have any guitarists in the room? Any guitarists in the room? No guitarists in the room? There's one. There's this podcast called Guitar Nerds. If you don't listen to it, it's really good. And they raise money through Patreon. At the end of every episode, they read out the names of every single Patreon backer that is at the top tier. And one of the guitar nerds who reads it out has to read it out in a single breath. So the way they try to get more Patreon backers is to encourage people to try and kill this guy trying to read them out with a single breath. It's quite funny. End of every episode. So here we go. Here we go. I'm told I'm not allowed to go past the black dot. Okay, you ready? Jeffrey Theobald works at Zendesk and organises Software Art Day, which is a meetup that explores modern software culture, which is dominated by agile methodologies, such as extreme programming that was created by Kent Beck. Thank you. Yeah, so that's a concept map, right? So now you know what they are. I don't expect you to care yet, right? Don't expect you to care yet. That is not where we are yet. Now you know what they are. So a little bit of background. The nouns are called concepts, just so we can talk in some jargon together. The verbs are called predicates. And the whole thing is called a proposition, okay? So just a bit of jargon. If I use those, you'll know what I mean. A little background. Who's read Domain-Driven Design and don't lie? Really? Is there a hand? There's a hand at the back. Yes. Somebody has read. God, millennials. Everything. This book came out in 2003. It's definitely in my top 10 books of all time. And I'm really old and I've read a lot of books, so listen to me, young people. But the bad news is it's a really hard read. One of my software guru heroes, Greg Young, says the way to read this book is to read chapters 1 to 3, so you know what the hell he's talking about. Then read chapters 11 to the end, because that's where the good stuff is. And then go through Death Valley from 4 to 10. Because if you just read straight through, you'll die in Death Valley and not get to the good stuff. This is a dense, hard read. But The cool thing about it, I'd never read another book. I'd never read a book before, and I don't know that I've read one since, that said, when you design software, you must consider the politics of the teams that are writing the software that you're interacting with. All right? It's like, it's not just, this is the way you should design your software given this problem. It's like, well, this is your problem, but if the upstream team don't like you and aren't going to listen and are busy doing other stuff, then do this instead. All right? It is fascinating and really highly recommended. And he has this concept of the ubiquitous language. So it basically says that if the people involved in the project talk the same language, so share the jargon, share a mental model of what the words mean, and they represent those concepts in the code as well, then you'll end up with a better result, basically. Software that reflects the domain. And it starts with the people sharing a ubiquitous language. So that's really what concept maps are going to be about. Now, I can't read that, but it says something important like something about the more pervasively the language is used, the better the understanding will flow. That's a summary of what his point of view is. So, if you don't believe that having software development teams share a mental model, that when one person says this word, that it means the same thing to the other people, if you don't think this matters, you can probably still go home and watch some Netflix. Because I'm not going to attempt to prove that to you. That is a presumption here, that we'll build better software if people have a shared mental model, okay? And for me, it started with Eric Evans and domain-driven design. It then moved on to this book. This is a book called Business Rules Concept by Ronald G. Ross, no relation to me. Has anyone read this? I'm not going to think that likely, but okay.
A much earlier version of this stuff.
Right. Hello, Simon.
No, it's Brett.
It's Brett. It's Brett. It sounded like Simon. Well, Brett's old like me, so he's read everything. Yeah. This is very, very not like what I said about domain-driven design. This is a very, very easy read, super easy. The density of value in this it's a little book, and all the important bits are highlighted in big, thick black boxes every few pages. You can rip through it, and it is a game changer. It is fantastic. And basically, this person, Ronald G. Ross, has been banging on for at least 20 or 30 years about business rules as a first-class citizen. So to him, a business rule exists independent of any system that implements it, any procedure that relies on it. They are first-class citizens, and that's the campaign he's been waging. And it's a good lens, and you can't... He's got this layered... his approach begins with concepts as the foundation layer, because you can't express a business rule unless the concepts are clear, okay? So this is a bit of a caution that when you talk about concept maps with people, they often try to get them to do more than they're intended to do. Concept maps aren't supposed to represent software structures. They're not supposed to represent any of these higher layers, rules, processes, interactions. It's just the words and what they mean, like the glossary. So I'll keep moving. Then there's this gentleman named Joseph Dean Novak. Nothing to do with software, everything to do with wetware. He's been banging on about how to do education better. Absolutely nothing to do with software. He's in the education industry in the States, and this book, Learning How to Learn, he's got two basic techniques. One is concept maps, and the other is this thing he's called Venn diagrams, which I don't get at all and don't use. And he does a lot of research in education, and basically demonstrating that the use of concept maps is actually scientifically effective for learning of all kinds. And basically, he thinks it's because concept maps is how our brains are structured. So that when you say a word, like Brett and I were at breakfast this morning, and this word blockchain came up, as it does. And without going into it and Brett and I having a punch up here on the camera, like, it doesn't trigger the same associations in our brains, okay? So it triggers all sorts of flames in his mind. I'm sort of more neutral, right? I'm like whatever. So when you're trying to transfer conceptual understanding from one person to another, Joseph D. Novak says that it is literally a case of building connections between concepts. And if you want someone to learn anything, the most important thing to find out is what they already know. For him, that's where teaching begins. You don't start with, like when we typically do it, we start with stuff we want to tell them. He starts with what they already know, and he uses concept maps to elicit what they know. How do they see the world? And then he'll build bridges to what they don't know. So sometimes I use an example that if I tried to explain to my 87-year-old father what Ruby on Rails is. I use Ruby on Rails here at Zendesk, we use it at Envato, and my dad has no idea. So if that was the challenge, then this way of doing it would begin with what he already knows. So I'd have Ruby on Rails as a concept out here in space, and then I'd try and work out what he already knows. And he knows what a computer is, and he knows that a computer runs programs. He's familiar with that concept of a program. And he knows that a web browser is a program and that a word processor is a program. And then I could go, okay, so a web browser displays web pages. You happy with that? We've got the concept of a web page. Yeah, happy with that. And a web page contains links. Are you happy with that? The concept of a link? Yeah, happy with that. Okay. And then you could build a bridge, you know, where you click on the link and that creates a request that goes to this other computer, a web server. That's just a computer like your computer, and it runs programs, right? And you can build a conceptual bridge. Does that make sense? So I'll move on because it's too long since I've had a laugh. Thank you very much. So here we are. So that's concept maps, what they are. Don't expect you to care yet. It's okay if you're wondering why you're here. Now, so part 2 is how they can help you. And this is maybe why you should care. So I'd like you to imagine that you've just joined a new team. So it's day 1 on this new team you've just joined. And the domain, the problem domain, is infrastructure asset management. And when I say infrastructure asset management, I don't mean EC2 instances and load balancers. I mean airports and train lines and trains and traffic lights and, you know, that real stuff. So they're infrastructure assets. That's the domain. You've landed in a team, and that's the domain they work in. And you don't have a clue. So I want, hands up anyone who is familiar with the domain of infrastructure asset management? Ah, damn it. I hope for nobody. Because I'm not an expert, right? I'm not an expert. I worked in it a little bit 10 years ago, but the point is, I want you to experience what it's like to use concept maps to learn about a new domain, okay? That's kind of the point of this part 2 of the talk. I want you to feel your ignorance. I want you to feel the burden of your ignorance, and then we'll make you feel a bit better. So, option 1 is a book. There's a many 100-page book called the International Infrastructure Management Manual, and you can Google for it and you can buy it. It's several $100s and it'll land on your desk and it'll thuds, the big thud factor. So on your first day I could say, well, just read that and remember that, and then that's option A. Option B is a 1-page concept map that looks like this. So I would prefer to give you this experience. Let's go out for a coffee and I will talk you through infrastructure asset management, the key concepts in 10 minutes, okay? So we have this concept of a service provider. And a service provider, you'll be unsurprised to know, provides a service. And they do that by using assets. So let's say you are, Yarra Trams or Metro Trains. You're a service provider. The service you provide is public transport, and the assets you use are all the stuff, the stations and the ticket machines, God help them, and turnstiles and everything, the tracks and all that stuff. And typically, the most common form of service provider is a local authority. So usually infrastructure assets, because they're physical, they tend to be in a geographical space. So you'll see that Melbourne Airport is an authority over what it has, and Sydney Airport and Metro Trains. So a particular type of service in a particular geographical area will tend to have a local authority, right? Is that pretty easy? And you can imagine how many assets they have. I used to work in a company that sold software to local councils, and obviously they're all over the country. So you'd go out and see these councils where, you fly to the nearest airport and drive for 3 weeks, and you pass 1 or 2 emus, and then you get to the, and you go, righto, how many assets have you got out here in the middle of nowhere? Oh, about $1 billion, right? So assets are a big deal, and the management of them is a big deal, even when you would think there was nothing there. All the roads and the power lines and the sewers and all the rest of it. So when we talk about the assets, what they care about, an asset has certain things. An asset has a value. You would be familiar with that. Like you buy a car and it has value and it loses it all. So it has a value. It has a condition. It's very, very important. People who manage assets really, really care about the condition. So are they in good repair, poor repair? Are there issues with them? They also have a current level of service and a target level of service. So they're capable of performing certain things. So they have a current capability, and then they have what you want them to do, which is the target level of service, okay? And then one of the very important things is that assets are subject to risk, okay? So that's it. We've had our coffee, and some of the jargon is starting to sink in. Is that making sense? And you can print that out on an A3 sheet and stick it on your desk and self-serve that, okay? Can you feel your mental model building? Does it feel good? No? Okay. Let's go a bit deeper. So this is the concept map of that big book. So one of the problems with concept maps is that they get really, really complicated. Now, which is the word that means it's okay? Like, I don't mean unnecessarily complicated. I mean they just are complicated, like they're complex. So whichever complex or complicated, whichever one that is. Like you can't, that's as simple as it gets. Intricate, that's okay? Like the point is, the concept map for any domain, pick whatever you like, Harry Potter. Imagine how big the concept map would be for Harry Potter, right? They get enormous. And we are carrying around these concept maps in our head. That's what that's only like one tiny little thing, infrastructure asset management of all the domains in the world, all the things you're carrying around in your head. So it is one of the inherent issues with concept maps is they get grotesquely large. And this is why, I'll show you later what our solution to that. We have a little website where you can solve that problem. But if you take anything away from this, take this. Don't use a diagramming tool to make a concept map. They aren't diagrams. They are collections of propositions. So the tool we use to build them, it's just a text file of all the propositions with the nouns capitalised and the verbs lowercase, and that's it, and the rest is graph viz. So you can pick and choose the bits you want and present the bits you want. So don't go away and start using a concept mapping tool and then blame me for how it doesn't work, because it doesn't work. They get too big. So we'll just have a quick walkthrough of this. No, we won't do that. You don't care. But I scare you with that because that's eventually the knowledge you'll build in this domain. But for now, you're working on some cards. You've joined the team. You're working on some cards and you're hearing this jargon and we just need to talk about this area of risk a little more. So, are you okay if I say an asset is subject to risk? If the asset is an aeroplane, they have all sorts of risks, right? And the risks are, the risk is a consequence of this concept called a hazard. So a hazard is anything that is a source of bad stuff in the world, right? So the weather is a hazard, right? If you get storms, you can have terrorism, you can have vandalism, you can have anything you can think of that's bad, earthquakes and all tsunamis, and the world is full of hazards. And because the hazards exist, our assets are subject to risk. Is that okay? Yeah? Yeah? You're smart enough to get that? And then a risk event is a consequence of a hazard. So if the hazard is bad weather, then the risk event is Hurricane Katrina, right? The class and the instance. You're all developers, you get that? Yeah? Easy? Easy? Okay? Great. Now, an asset is also subject to failure modes. Can anyone suggest a way that an aeroplane can fail? Well, yeah. Engine failure. Smacking into the ground. Ceasing to be an aeroplane. You know. I speak as someone whose daughter's about to fly back from China. I shouldn't be saying things like this, but you know, if the asset is a ferry, then it can sink, it can lose thrust, it can lose its ability to steer, it can have a hull breach. So just ways, by their nature, assets have ways they can fail. And they're called failure modes. Is that okay? There's a bit more jargon. And an asset has faults. If you think that aeroplane you got on last month was free of faults, are you that naive? It's just whether it's a sufficiently low number and okay types to fly. And faults are occurrences of failure modes. So in the same way that the hazard was the concept of a storm and Hurricane Katrina was the risk event, then a failure mode is the idea of sinking if you're a boat, and the fault is that that boat on that day actually sank. Right? So it's just the class and instance again. Yeah, this is easy, right? Okay, now we said that assets are subject to risk, and now we're saying that risk results in failure modes. So the risk that a storm will cause Windsor Station to flood again, and the failure mode is that, you know, the trains are all disrupted and the signals fail. Then we can say, it's getting bigger and scarier now, and I'm going faster, that a risk event causes faults. So the storm causes the roof to collapse, or that hole in the roof. And then we said before that a risk is a consequence of hazard, but I've also said that the risk event is an occurrence of a hazard. So the next slide is going to connect that with that. And that's the last slide for this phase, right? Now, this is where people can go, oh my God, too much. But how many concepts do we have here? 6, right? There's not that many. And if you look at each of them, like if we look at asset, how many arrows emanate from asset? It's actually 3, because it's 3. So an asset is subject to both risk and failure modes, and it has faults. That's the only things we're saying about an asset. That's all you need to know about an asset at this point. Those 3 things. That's quite easy. Right? If I look at risk, how many arrows are associated with risk? 3. So an asset is subject to risk, risk results in failure modes, and risk is a consequence of hazard. That's all we're saying about risk. And then faults. How many arrows are associated with fault? 3. So an asset has faults. Faults are an occurrence of a failure mode, and they're caused by risk events. That's all we're saying about faults. So as a software person, you can start to go, okay, if I'm building a system in this domain, my engineer's brain's going to go, oh well, hazards are like quite a relatively small and quite stable list. It's not like the world's inventing new classes of hazard every day. So it's going to be quite small and stable. My assets are going to have probably a very large number, but also probably relatively stable. And then faults, they're just going to be coming in all day, every day, and just growing forever, right? So that's okay. You start to get a sense of the domain. But the magic, the absolute magic of this is that I'm not a subject matter expert, okay? And having a coffee with you on your first day in a new team talking about a domain, I don't need a subject matter expert to get into your brain what needs to be there for you to work on this team. That's the magic. You don't have to worry about the fidelity of the transfer of the conceptual knowledge. However, now that I've taken that slide off the screen, how many people think they could reproduce that tomorrow?
I have a photo.
Guillaume has a photo. The fact that your hands are down is perfectly normal and natural and appropriate. It is not the kind of information we retain easily. That's why printing them out and having them handy until they become normal and the jargon just becomes the way you speak in that team. So it's okay to not be able to reproduce them. That's why you put them in a system. So now you can have a bit of a sense. So part one of the talk was what they are. Part two was how to put them to use. And most people can go, yeah, I can see how that would help and get people on the same page. But you know, James, my team, we're on the same page. We're totally on the same page. We've been working together for a long time. It's like we got this lingo, we got this shorthand. It's like we're all on the same page. And to them I say, would you mind if I check? Would you mind if we check? So this is part three of the talk, where we will talk about checking what is in people's heads. And I wonder what we'll find. So, I wonder what you think we'll find. So, you might think your team has a ubiquitous language, but you might want to check. So, this is a photo of a whiteboard where I did a workshop with a team at Envato a couple of years ago. And this team, their domain is the money aspects of our e-commerce platform, okay? So the workshop begins by saying, okay, everybody, let's get around the whiteboard and let's just write down all the concepts. Just what are the concepts in your world? What are you always talking about? And in this domain, you'll see, what's that? Spendings, that's a really weird concept. We should have invoice and VAT, and we've got deposit and commercial transaction, withdrawal. You know, my writing's quite bad, but you get them all out, right? And then you say, okay, now I want everyone to go off independently and make a concept map that is how you think of those things being connected, okay? So everyone takes the same list of concepts and then they come back with their concept map that represents the way they would express the connections. Does that make sense? And if people had the same mental model, what should you see?
Same thing.
You should see concept maps that are very similar. What do you think you see? So imagine you've joined this team and we say, oh, sorry, I can't take you to coffee, I'm the subject matter expert, but go and have a coffee with, pick a person at random from the team, they'll explain the domain to you, okay? If you pick the first person, you'll get that. If you pick the next person, you'll get that. If you pick the next person, you'll get that. And as someone who cares about the team's mental model, that's a little bit terrifying. So, So without going through each of those in detail, that would be too mind-numbing. Let's measure how similar they are. So the first measure is how many propositions are unique. So in this example, I collected all the propositions that people made in their concept maps. So we had 6 team members. They made a total of 111 propositions in all their concept maps. So about 20 each to connect those concepts. So the number of propositions that were unique, as in made by only one of the 6 people, more than 3/4. So more than 3/4. So that means there's a 77% chance that if someone tells you something about this domain, they're the only person that's going to tell you that thing. What do you reckon? Is that good? That's not good. How are we doing for time? We're doing okay? So you go, that's not good. Okay. All right. How many of the 111 were shared by more than half the team? Let's say, like, how many did at least 4 people say? 4? That's all right. So you got 4 that would get voted into being actually part of your, there's a good chance of hearing one of those 4 things. Good chance. Better than 50% chance that the random person will tell you that. Okay, who would like to guess how many were shared by the whole team? You've seen this movie before. 0. Not a single proposition would you hear reliably from everyone in the team. And now people go, yeah, but this is set up. This team is must have only just met. Must have had a whole bunch of people who didn't know what they're talking about. No, this team had an average tenure of more than a year. Been delivering software really well. So maybe it doesn't matter. But then other people come and look at the code and go, like you do whenever you look at code that you see for the first time. Okay, and then a valid criticism of that approach is that, someone might have said the same thing but expressed it slightly differently, okay? So someone might have said, an invoice is a commercial transaction, and someone else might have had a typo and said is an commercial transaction. And then that's not fair to count them as different. So, okay, we'll cut them some slack. We'll soften it, and we'll cut them some slack. And we will count any 2 propositions that connect the same concepts as equivalent. So that's just saying, if you say concept something's concept, and someone else says that same something else's, I'm not saying this very well, am I? If someone says A something B, and someone else says A something else B, as long as there's A and B as the 2 concepts, we'll count those propositions as correct, even if the predicates are just totally wrong, okay? So you would expect to see more shared mental model, would you not? Yes. So let's see how much more similar. The 3/4 of unique propositions now plummets to 2/3. About 2/3. So it's better. It's better, right? That means there's a 64% chance that what you get told is just like a random the concepts are just random. That's the most likely thing, is that you'll be told a random thing. That's what it is. The number of propositions shared by more than half the team rockets from 4 to 6. So that means there's only 6 out of those 111 statements that even connect the same two concepts. Only 6 things where two concepts were considered important enough to talk about being connected. All right? So, and what about shared by the whole team?
0.
So of course you are all thinking, yeah, but my team wouldn't be like that. But have you checked? Right? So, I am forced to conclude, having done this quite a few times, not just in Envato, many years since, long ago. The app that I'll show you in a bit we built it in 2009. Doing this a long time. And it's the same every time. People think they have a shared mental model and they say words to each other and they smile and nod like, yeah, we're on the same page here. And they're just not. And that is why your software is like it is. Because you walk around with a mess in your head. And we discovered, for example, in this workshop, a classic example of a serious misconception. So we saw concepts on there like deposit and withdrawal and commercial transaction. So just to bore you with a little bit of domain, a commercial transaction is something that is taxable. So when you buy something at the supermarket, there's GST applies. But if you just deposit money in the bank, there's no tax on that, right? You can get it back out again. You can put $50 in, get $50 out. Like, don't worry about the fees. Like, there's no tax, right? It's not a taxable event. It's not a commercial transaction. Well, it turned out that on, a senior developer in that team, on their concept map, said a deposit is a commercial transaction. And the BA nearly had an aneurysm. Like, what do you mean a deposit's a commercial transaction? Like, well, of course it's a commercial transaction. Like, step away from the keyboard. Like, do not sit down and code for the rest of the day until we talk about, because if you walk around with those just misconception, literally missing the concepts, you will then write code that is unlikely to be correct, unlikely to be understandable. So does that make sense? So that's part 3, concept maps as a way to check if people are on the same page. And I heartily recommend it to you because it's such a lull. Like it's really quite counterintuitive. Any questions? Oh, Jeffrey doesn't want me to ask questions yet, does he? I don't think he likes questions. So then people say, well, what are the next steps? Typically what you would do is you would get all those concept maps. You would, pick the best one. Usually there's one that's the best. Sometimes it's a tester, sometimes a developer. You've got a BA, they'll usually have a good one. And then you work through all the others you tighten it up, and then you work through all the others to pick out the gold. There's usually gold in all of them, and assemble your team's actual mental model. So, if you want to do that, that's what I recommend. And it's not easy, but it's not as hard as you might think either. Thank you, Zendesk. Thank you, Software Out There.